Okay. Hello, everyone. It's so nice to see you, and it's so nice to be here. And thank you, Pat and Claire, for inviting me. I um I have been a private investigator for 3 decades, and I worked the first 10 years as a regular uh, civil investigator, working on divorce cases and custody cases and embezzlement cases and just that kind of stuff and in Alabama. Mine is sort of a fish out of water story. uh Transplanted there due to my husband's job relocation, and had to figure out how I was going to make a living and entertain myself in an area that was completely radically different than any place I'd ever lived before. So
Susan,
I started my
before you
agency.
go any further, can you click into the slideshow so it fills the screen for everyone?
Where is that? Tell
Up
me
to the
again.
top.
Okay.
Yep, to the right.
Yep. Okay. Right there. Okay.
And then from the beginning.
Okay. And then you want me to start over again or just go
No,
ahead?
no, no, that's great. Just hit from the
Okay.
beginning so that your slides kind of fill up the screen and
Okay.
everybody doesn't see the presenter view.
So my background was as a journalist. And when I decided that I wanted to become a private investigator, I thought that I could take the uh, sort of the journalist motto of the who, what, when, where, why, and how, and apply that to investigations. And it worked. So 9 years in, I was pretty burned out, and I was thinking about closing my my agency. And I pretty much reached the decision that I was going to close it. I wasn't going to take any more cases. I was just going to finish up what I had. And then I got a call from a legal secretary in Birmingham, Alabama. And I was in her Rolodex or whatever they used at the time. And she asked me if I could pull some records for her. And it was part of a team operation, a team of attorneys. And she didn't give me any details. She just wanted to know if I was available to pull some records. And I said, sure. And she told me when to come up to Birmingham. And I walked into a room of attorneys from all over the country, and they were working on a capital murder case. And that case completely turned the nature of my business around. I was just immediately riveted by the level of the gravity, the seriousness of the work. So, as I learned how to do it, I also applied the who, what, when, where, why, and how. So, we can go ahead and get into the presentation now. So, the 5 W's and the 1 H are the who, what, when, where, why, and how of how to avoid or reverse a death sentence, because I worked both on pretrial cases and post-conviction cases. So first we'll talk about what is capital murder, because it's a little bit different than all of the other levels of murder that are out there. This is a legal classification for homicide that carries a sentence of life without parole or the death penalty. It's either or. If you're convicted of a capital crime, those are the two choices. There aren't any other sentencing options. And in order for it to be a capital murder, there must be an additional crime committed at the time of the murder, and that's called an aggravator. First-degree murder is often defined as willful, deliberate, and premeditated homicide. But capital murder requires that aggravating charge, an aggravating felony charge. So to elevate a first-degree murder to a capital case, Idaho law, I looked this up. I've not worked any cases in Idaho, but so if anybody else knows, you can set me straight here. But it talks about the defendant has either committed multiple murders or had a prior murder conviction. The murder was committed during the commission of another felony, such as arson, burglary, kidnapping, rape, or robbery. The act was especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel. Those are the key words for a capital case. It needs to be described as heinous, atrocious, or cruel. The defendant showed utter disregard for human life. The murder was committed for payment or financial gain, or the killing of a child or a law enforcement officer. Those are pretty much the standards in most
Yeah,
states. As of
you
now,
too. Really?
Hey, somebody is not muted. I'm not
Aldi?
sure who it is. Oh, here we go. I think I found him.
okay.
I'm going to put him on mute.
Kessinger.
Yeah, okay.
In some states, like Alabama, carjacking or shooting into a vehicle can also uh, turn into a capital murder charge. And the key words here are heinous, atrocious, and cruel. And those are fairly subjective phrases, but that's the standard for a capital murder charge. Are there any questions on that? So, what is mitigation? Mitigation is a basis for compassion, not an excuse. It doesn't excuse or justify criminal behavior, but it's intended to provide the court, defined as judge and jurors, a full picture of the defendant as a person. Essentially, mitigation takes away and explains to the judge and the jury who the defendant is. Prosecutors often portray a defendant as a monster, cold-blooded, and likely, an animal likely to kill again if he doesn't receive the maximum sentence. Jurors are sometimes made to be afraid of the client. If the client is said to be a gang member, for example, there's certain phrases that are often used in a courtroom to describe a defendant. And they're not always true. I'm not saying that prosecutors lie. I'm saying that prosecutors want to win a case. One of the most chilling examples of that was during the Barry Jones trial out of Opelika, Alabama, which is near Auburn, which everybody knows Auburn. I was Barry's mitigation specialist, and the case should not have gone to trial, I learned later, but it did. I had developed some pretty good mitigation on the basis of his school records, which indicated that he needed to be tested for MR, for intellectual disabilities. And his mother was constantly changing schools. He was constantly going to different schools. And when I finally got my hands on all of his permanent records, I found it was strewn with notes where they had asked the mother for permission to test him, and the mother would always deny. She wouldn't allow him to be tested. So there was an indication there that he had a, at the time the phrase was mental retardation, is what they suspected. But the mother had never allowed him to be tested. He was young, and he was charged with killing his 2-year-old son. And during the 2 years leading up to the trial, there were numerous status conferences. And during these status conferences, if you've ever worked a criminal case, you will know that these are basically the prosecutor and the defense attorneys and the client appear before the judge and they discuss issues that have not been resolved. And the prosecution in Barry Jones's case early on said that they were going to bring in the testimony, they were going to bring in the emergency room doctor who treated the toddler. And the emergency room doctor was going to testify that the baby had been sodomized. And we had all of the medical records, and the chief medical examiner of Alabama had done the autopsy and had found absolutely no indication that the baby had been assaulted. And the judge knew that this information was false. The prosecutor knew that that information was false. But when the trial came, they put him on the stand. They put that emergency room doctor on the stand, and he testified that the baby had been sexually assaulted. Well, this being Alabama, you could just see the looks on the jurors' faces, and you could see that somebody was looking for a rope to hang that boy from the courthouse steps. He was done at that point, and the case should never have gone to trial. It was just sickening when that happened, and it didn't matter what the chief medical examiner said. It didn't matter that there was no basis. It didn't matter that we could show that that wasn't true. The fact of the matter is, this doctor testified to it, and they heard that, and that was that. And he was, of course, convicted of capital murder and the death of his 2-year-old. Now, mitigation helped. We rolled into mitigation. We had aunts and uncles and his mother. I mean, we had just everyone. We had expert witnesses. We had every witness that we could throw at it. It was a brilliant mitigation. But the problem was he was convicted. And so the best outcome at that point was a sentence of life without parole. And honestly, he was 21 years old. And that's what you face when you go into capital murder trial, is that politics get in the way. The judge was up for reelection. He likes to show that he's tough on crime. I had 2 other cases out of his courtroom after that, and each time I was scared to death to go in front of him. But we were actually able to resolve both of those with plea deals afterwards. And a plea deal is always, always, always what you want to work for. The Barry Jones case happened in 2010, and after that point, I decided, if we can avoid trial, let's avoid trial. Let's see if we can get a plea deal. Let's see if we can get some sunshine in a sentence. Let's see what we can do here. And I never had a case go to trial after 2010, after Barry Jones's case. So that's a little bit of some background there. Does anybody have any questions on that? Okay. Capital mitigation refers to the process of presenting evidence during the sentencing phase of a capital trial to argue against the imposition of the death penalty. It's not about proving innocence. A jury has already found the client guilty. Mitigation humanizes the defendant and provides context that might persuade a jury to choose a sentence of life without parole rather than death by execution. This is a presentation of a person's story, often told through testimony by family, teachers, and experts. The judge and jurors learn why this person's life matters and why it should be spared. Mitigation evidence is pretty much anything that can help tell a person's life story. These can be school records, birth records. These can be any kind of records. I personally love certified records. I love Social Security records. I love mental health records, medical records. And when I'm working on a case, I'm looking for medical records and mental health records and records for the parents as well, grandparents. If there's any kind of evidence of any kind of mental illness in the family, I'm looking for their records and getting all of their records. Then I also do things like extensive interviews. I generally would have 2 years to work on a case. And I would do extensive interviews with pretty much anybody who would talk with me. I would start with the client, okay, and ask about how he or she was raised. Who raised you? Was it a mother, father? What was the composition of your immediate family, siblings? Who went to school? How far did the client get in school? What is the history? I had one client, Frankie Bradford, who thought that the woman was his grandma, might not be his grandma, and it turned out she wasn't. He thought that the women that he lived with, who he called his cousins, it turned out that they weren't his cousins. During the course of working on his case, I found his biological father, um, and I found his biological mother. And but sometimes they don't know their own history. Sometimes they don't know who they came from and how they came to be in the situations where they are. And that's the role of a mitigation specialist, is to learn about the family systems. And then during of course, you're also looking for criminal records. You're looking for any kind of criminal records that anyone in the family may have: mother, father, brother, sister, uncle, anyone who the client was exposed to during growing up. You're essentially wanting, a complete understanding of the universe. And then during, and these are the tricky ones, because during your interviews, you want to learn about the history of trauma, abuse, or neglect. You also want to learn about you want to learn about violence. What was this child exposed to when he was a child? And so these are not hour-long interviews. These are you you work with these people, you have to gain their trust, and essentially almost become part of their family to be able to get the deep dark secrets. And boy, a lot of these families had some deep, dark secrets, that's for sure. You're talking about incest and um, sex trafficking to pay off gambling debts, and just you name it. One of my clients, Casey McWhorter, was getting high by the time he was 6 years old. His older cousins were teaching him how to huff gasoline. This is all the kind of stuff that it takes a while to get to. Initially, a client may tell you his life was normal when he grew up. Well, that's because it was normal for him. And so you have to figure out what his normal was, right? So um, during the mitigation process, I work as a third person on a criminal defense team. A capital murder team has to have two attorneys. It has to have a first and a second chair attorney. And then a mitigation specialist is appointed, is court appointed. These are generally, I've only worked indigent defense cases with the death penalty, so I get paid by the state, and I would be appointed by a judge to work on a case. But a mitigation specialist is sort of the person who's, my role is to prepare for the sentencing. And along the way, if I can come up with some sort of evidence that would support asking for a plea deal, or would sort of take away some of the underpinnings of the prosecutor's case, then that's a bonus in terms of urging the client. Well, I could talk with the client, and see if the client's amenable to a plea deal. And then, once I'm fairly certain that the client would be okay, then I could present um, my argument to the defense attorneys. But it had reached the point after the Barry Jones trial that whenever I would be approached to work on a pretrial case, I would ask if there was any way that we could work toward a plea deal and avoid trial altogether. So that's what we would do. But anyway, the mitigation specialist assists defense attorneys in preparing for capital trials and post-conviction appeals by conducting a thorough, independent, scorched earth investigation of a client's life history. A mitigation specialist must gain over time the trust of the defendant, his family, and community members to learn as much as possible about how the defendant ended up charged with a capital crime. In many cases, the client may feel his background was normal, when in fact it was chaotic and filled with trauma. And then I would also, once I would be gathering this, I would be thinking, okay, who else do we need to find for the team? Do we need a forensic psychologist? Do we need a clinical social worker? Do we need a psychiatrist? And it would all depend on what kind of records I was gathering as to who we would pull into the case for expert witnesses. So, what is scorched earth mitigation? So we dig deeply into a family's life story, conducting extensive interviews with the client, family members, friends, teachers, ministers, and other community members, essentially anyone who came in contact with this person. Sometimes it's even probation officers, juvenile probation officers, if somebody had had some juvenile problems. It's amazing the kind of people that you end up talking to get information and to help your client. Then gathering records. Everyone who I needed records from would sign release forms, allowing me to gather the records. Some things actually in some states require subpoenas. Sometimes the Medicaid food stamps, those records. And if there had been investigations done by Department of Human Services, those would require subpoenas. But we would have to know that those records were there in order to look for them. But that was always part of my job. And then I would visit homes, neighborhoods, any kind of institutions, including schools that shaped the defendant. And then as I gathered, after every interview, I would type up my case notes and send them to the attorneys. And after every single interview, I would begin building a case chronology, a family tree, and an index of records. And it weaves all of the information into a compelling narrative that explains the path that led to the crime. And it can go back several generations. It can go back to grandparents, great grandparents, and it can go forward to present day. And then I would begin crafting lay witness testimony in preparation of the sentencing phase or in preparation of the testimony that we would be presented at a post-conviction evidentiary hearing. And then I would coordinate the mitigation lay witnesses. Those would be teachers, family members, ministers, whoever else, and coordinate with the trial attorneys and the expert witnesses, such as forensic psychologists and clinical social workers, and get the witnesses ready to testify. During my career as a mitigation specialist, I already spoke about this. After 9 years as a PI, I was burned out. The team was comprised by the first capital murder case I worked on was a post-conviction case. And the team was comprised by lawyers from large firms in Palo Alto, California, and Washington, D.C. And they were working on the appeals from Melvin Davis, a man who'd been on Alabama's death row for about a decade at that point. I was immediately just engaged and riveted by this work, by these groups of attorneys that were just so intent on finding any kind of foothold for an appeal to remove a death sentence or ask for a new trial. So I began gathering records and working with this team toward an evidentiary hearing in which the original trial judge would hear mitigation evidence that should have been presented during Mr. Davis's original trial, but was not. And it was a fascinating experience and it led to my work on 36 other death penalty cases over my career. From 2005 to 2023, I had the privilege of working as a mitigation specialist for 37 clients. Half of these were pretrial cases, and the other half were appealing their death sentences. I had 19 pretrial clients. 4 received sentences of life without parole. They went to trial. 13 received sentences with possible parole. Those were plea deals. 1 client's charge was reduced to manslaughter, and 1 took an Alford plea. And of the 18 post-conviction clients, most are still appealing their sentences, but 3 have been executed: Dominic Ray and Alan Miller of Alabama, and Robert Betts of Georgia. And Robert was he actually became my friend. And I'm going to tell you just a minute about Robert. The first time I met Robert, he had been on Georgia's death row for about 9 years, maybe 9 years. And he was a co-defendant. The victim was one gunshot wound, one fatal, that was fatal. And there were 2 defendants, Robert Butts and his accomplice. Which one was the shooter? Well, during the first trial of his accomplice, the DA said that his accomplice was the shooter, without a doubt. Told the jurors that without a doubt he was the shooter. 6 weeks later, in Robert's case, a different jury was told that Robert was the shooter. Who was the shooter? Both men were found guilty of capital murder. There was no mitigation presented in either trial. And both received death sentences, and both are now deceased. And that always struck me. How can both people be guilty of capital murder? So the first time I met Robert, he told me, I asked about his childhood, and he told me that his childhood was normal. And his childhood was the worst childhood out of any that I'd ever seen. But by 10 years old, he was living in a trailer in the country by himself with a younger, severely mentally disturbed brother, a second brother, and a little sister. His mother was pretty much AWOL. She was a drug addict. She was gone. She would disappear for weeks at a time. Grandma had taken in the older daughter, and she would sometimes drop off bags of groceries for Robert to feed his siblings. It was the most disheartening case, the most disheartening situation I'd ever thought that I would ever see. But the case itself was fascinating as I got to work with independently all of his siblings who were now adults. And his mother did not initially want to work with me, but eventually she came around. But a great aunt and uncles in the community, and there would have been this huge support system for Robert in his community. But everyone was sort of caught up in their own lives, and this kid just sort of, fell into the cracks, fell into the margins.
Susan,
But yeah,
can I interrupt your story for a moment so that we can
sure.
conduct the drawing before the end of the hour?
Sure.
I think now might be a good time. And Pat's ready to
Okay.
go. So,
Okay.
Pat, you're on mute. I'll unmute you.
I always forget the mute. Susan, your story is so compelling. I feel bad interrupting with our raffle, but you know, our raffle is really important because we're raffling off your book, your autograph.
Okay.
So here we go. I'm just gonna reach in, not look, you know, the old fashioned way, and pull out a name. And the name is Yasmin Vargas, who I believe
All
is
right.
intern attending. So Yasmin, um, give your address to Matt, and Matt will make sure I get it, and I will send you the book. Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Yasmin.
Yeah. Congratulations. And if you enjoy the book, drop me a note. Let me know. So
Thanks,
anyway,
Pat.
we went through this and we had this huge evidentiary hearing. It was held right at the prison in just outside of Atlanta. And we had teachers from his elementary school and from high school. And it was the most sincere outpouring of support for Robert that I could have ever imagined. People who were happy to step up and try to help this guy get off of death row. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get him off of death row. I worked on that case from 2005 through 2007, and Robert and I became good friends. Robert would send me pictures that he had drawn, and we often teased each other because he published a book of his drawings and his writings before I ever published. And he never forgot my birthday, never forgot Christmas. And then I was brought back in the case again in 2017 when he got a death warrant, and worked on his case through his execution in May 2018. And so his story, I won an International Journalism Award for in competition a couple of years ago, but it took probably 6 or 7 years of writing it on and off to finally get a tone that worked on it. It's very, very hard to tell somebody's story. It is. Anyway, so there was that. When I do chronologies, this is what a chronology template looks like. And it goes through every single record, every single interview, and it pulls out the highlights. But it also lists all of the different people. And what was interesting in both sides of Robert's family, both the his maternal side and his paternal side, there was extensive mental illness throughout the family. And he had a brother who was also extraordinarily ill, mentally ill. The family was asked to place him in the Children's Hospital in Augusta, Georgia, for permanent housing. But his mother didn't want to lose her check. She didn't want to lose her SSI check for Dominic, so she would not allow him to get the treatment that he needed. And he eventually died in prison himself. But anyway, it was a unbelievable story. And then you have his two sisters. One is a lawyer now, and another who's an accomplished business person. And so how do you describe, how do you account for children ending up differently, having different outcomes? Anyway, it's a fascinating business. And so to sort of wrap up, here's me. This is my latest book. It's called Southern Lies and Homicides, Tales of Betrayal and Murder and Betrayal. And I'm a licensed private investigator, a criminal defense and capital mitigation specialist, a journalist, and author. And I live with my husband, 2 golden retrievers, and a black cat. Anyway, does anyone have any questions? Okay. Mike?
It's building off that question that was posted in the chat. When you're going after the mitigation, I understand that you do extensive backgrounds and you do everything you can to try to get all the information. But if there's 1 or 2 subjects that absolutely sway or help, which ones would those be in your experience? The subject that says, when this happens, this has the biggest impact.
Um, I think it's probably abandonment by the mother. In many communities, abandonment by the father is sort of uh, par for the course, but I think it's abandonment by the mother that has the biggest impact. And then if there's a family history of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, you really have to look at that as well. So it's not necessarily poverty, and but it's definitely what kind of support the child's getting from caretakers. Yeah. Okay, Pat.
I need clarification. So mitigation is the vehicle for, and the time for considering how a person was raised to determine their sentencing or mitigate their sentencing. Is that correct?
No, it's really more about telling the person's life story and humanizing the defendant to the jury, because the jury will be the ones who will decide on, is it life without parole? Is this person's life worth saving? Or should this person receive a death sentence?
Okay.
And and if you've got people, if you've got aunts or mothers or sisters or forensic psychologists or social workers who can describe to the jury who this person is, because we're not going to put him on the stand, then it softens. And especially if the way the story is told, the jurors are reminded of, they may have a nephew with a drug problem. They may have, there are very, very few people these days that don't have some sort of frame of reference for these troubles that we have in society. I often talk about when you walk into a capital murder trial, and you go into the sentencing phase, all of the ills of society come walking in with you. Um, you're talking about many of these families have histories of substance abuse and of mental health issues and of lack of education, poverty, sheer poverty, no training, no educational training at all. These kinds of things. And if you can talk about this defendant in a way that resonates with the jury, you're much more likely to get an outcome of life without. I've just seen it work, but that's really, once you get to the sentencing phase in a capital trial, those are the only two choices, are life without or the death penalty. And so humanizing the defendant so that they see him as the kid down the street, like I said, someone's nephew, someone's niece. If you can humanize that client, then you can save their lives. And that's what that is. Tell their story. Okay, Claire.
Yeah, so I mean, it kind of blew my mind when you said that in the Barry Jones case, the prosecutor kind of deliberately presented evidence that was known to be false.
Yep.
Is that's got to be uncommon, I would hope, but did they counter it? Did they, like, what
We
happened?
counted. The defense team spent a huge amount of energy. I mean, it was still being debated right up until the day before the trial began, as to the defense did not want that doctor on the stand. They knew that that baby had not been sodomized. We knew. But the
So were they
problem
just
was
were they just making stuff up, that doctor?
the doctor believed that that's what it was. There's a certain physical thing that happens when babies die.
Mhm.
And I don't remember the biological part of it anymore. But the doctor interpreted that as the baby having been sodomized. And the chief medical examiner refuted his testimony. The defense put him on, he refuted the testimony. But it didn't matter, because as soon as the jurors heard that this boy, who was 19, 20 at the time, sodomized that baby, they didn't need to hear anymore. That was it. And it was brought up on appeal. it was brought up on the automatic appeal. There's one automatic appeal, and I don't know where it stands in anymore, but Barry is serving a sentence of life without parole. Does that happen? It happens more than you would think. And you see it when you go to those status conferences. You see how different pieces of evidence, there's no surprise. The judge knows exactly what's going to be in his courtroom. He knows exactly what the testimony is going to be, just like prosecution and defense doesn't necessarily know. I mean, I'm sorry, the prosecution does not necessarily know what the defense is going to put up as evidence, but the defense certainly knows what the prosecution is going to put up as evidence. So there's no surprises there. Everybody knew. And it was infuriating. And what do you do at that point? That's it. That's the way the system works, at least in Alabama. And I'd say it's probably pretty accurate in Louisiana and Tennessee and Georgia, Florida, Texas. People lie. And that's why in this book, I come up with, there's no justice in the justice system. Yeah, sad. Anybody else?
I have a question if nobody else does.
Okay.
I assume that the capital murder cases always have a mitigation investigator, but I work with an attorney who gets court-appointed cases, and he told me he's hired me on a few of them to do mitigation investigations.
Mhm.
And the court has funds of maybe only $2,000 for a mitigation investigator in these cases. And this attorney tells me that almost no attorneys are aware of these funds or utilize them.
Mhm.
And I am ruminating on how to get this message out to the attorneys so that they do use it. And I've had great results with my mitigation investigations.
Mhm. Mitigation works.
Yeah.
There's no question that mitigation works. Um, I don't know what the rules are in Idaho,
I'm in
but I know
Virginia.
what they are in Alabama and Utah and Georgia and some of these other states. The Office of Indigent Defense, the State Office of Indigent Defense, can give you all of the information that you want about the funding and what kind of funding is available. And it's just a matter of the attorneys being in touch with the Office of Indigent Defense and getting, sort of their worksheet. And you should be on the list of mitigation specialists with them. And is there a group like in Alabama, they have the Equal Justice Initiative. And Equal Justice Initiative did a lot of attorney training for dealing with capital cases. I don't know how many capital cases you all get a year, but I can say that Alabama has 163 people on death row in Alabama. And just that I worked 37 cases in less than 20 years. Um, there's a lot of need for indigent defense work and mitigation specialists. Yep.
Can I add one thing?
Sure.
One of the things that I did immediately is when I met with them, sometimes in prison, sometimes not, for the first time, the defendant, I would immediately get them to sign a records release form.
Yeah.
And that way, even if they don't want me to go looking for things like, were you in special education classes in your school, kind of things that they might be embarrassed about.
Sure.
Once they sign that records release form, I'm free to find out almost anything I want about them.
So I used several release forms. I used a medical release form, a HIPAA form, and I used a general release form for records for criminal records, for birth records, any kind of, whatever kind of records, and school records. And
Mhm.
then I also used, I would always bring in a Social Security form for them to sign to. There's a release of records with Social Security. And then if I had any indication that the person had been a veteran or had done any kind of military service, I would have a release form for that as well.
Mm.
And so I just had a kit of release forms.
And I think it's smart to hit them with it, upon introduction, just kind of like,
Oh, absolutely. Well, you settle in a little bit, but then you have them sign it. And, like I talk about with Robert Butts, the first time I met him, when I had him sign the releases, we had a very, very short time. The Georgia prison was terrible. Um, the capital, he was on death row, so the diagnostic and classification prison was terrible on time about letting you into the prison. And so had a very, very short period of time. But I used that as to, when I handed him the pen to sign the forms, I realized he was having trouble reading, and I didn't know, can you not read? Can you not see? And it turned out that he needed glasses, but they wouldn't get him glasses. And he said, "No, I can read. I can read." And then I noticed that he was signing with his left hand, and we talked about that. And then noticed that his birthday was very close to mine, so we talked about our horoscope signs, that kind of thing. These are just great ways to sort of break the ice and relax a situation that's fairly tense. The first time you go in and meet with a client, it's a little worrisome. You know, what are you going to get? What are you going to expect? What are you going to get here? So, yeah, it's just, any kind of tricks that you can come up with to break the ice and open that line of communication and have them give you the information that you need. Yeah,
can
it's great.
I'll
Good for
say
you.
one last thing and then I'll mute myself. After doing the mitigation investigations, sort of, with every single investigation, I keep a mitigation investigation in mind as I'm doing the investigation, because you never know how it's going to end up. So you just sort of having that mitigation in the back of your mind and keeping it as you're doing your primary investigation in case you need it at
Sure,
the end.
sure, sure.
I'm going to
It's a documentation that's critical.
right.
Documentation of everything is critical. It's just like journalism. It's just like any other type of investigation that you're doing. Yeah. But it does. Mitigation changes the way you approach your clients. I found that I had no more patience for people's divorce cases or custody cases or any of those anymore once I started doing mitigation work. Mitigation work to me was just a godsend, really and truly, and how it changed my perspective and how I viewed people and situations after I began doing it. Yeah. So good for you. That's great. Anybody else? No?
All right. Well, we're just about right at the exact time. So
Mhm.
that worked out perfectly.
I appreciate you all very much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk today. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out.
Thank you, Susan. And I have shared your information in the chat. So if anybody wants to find Susan's website, maybe you're interested in reading some of her writing. I've browsed around a bit on her Substack, and she's a great author, great writer. Very interesting stories. You can find her there. You can go look at her website and maybe buy a copy of the book if you're interested. I believe I've also shared an email. You can find her
Substack's
pretty
there.
easily. Substack, is
Yep.
that the one? Okay, perfect. All right. Well, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Susan, for presenting. This was fascinating. I very much enjoyed it. And we will see you at the next Wednesday webinar.
That sounds great. Thank you.